Some guys think a piece of colored fabric around their waist makes them invincible. They mistake the padded, controlled environment of a gym for the chaotic, unforgiving reality of the real world. When a cocky 24-year-old martial arts prodigy pushed a quiet, limping bus driver to the breaking point on a freezing Tuesday evening, he didn't just lose a fight. He woke up a sleeping apex predator. Oak Creek, Colorado, was the kind of town where reputation was currency. Nestled deep in the Rockies, it was a place of harsh winters, blue-collar grit, and a fiercely competitive local sports culture. In this small pond, Trent Lawson was the biggest, most aggressive fish. At 24, Trent was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt under a prestigious regional lineage. He ran the local MMA gym, Apex Striking and Grappling, and had recently gone undefeated in the regional NAGA, North American Grappling Association, and king of the cage amateur circuits. Trent was physically imposing, 6'2", 210 pounds of lean, tattooed muscle. He moved with the rolling, loose-limbed swagger of a man who knew he could physically dismantle 99% of the population. But Trent had a fatal flaw: his ego. His entire identity was wrapped up in his ability to dominate others. He lacked the quiet humility that true martial arts are supposed to instill. To Trent, the world was just an extension of the octagon, and everyone in it was either a sparring partner or a victim. On the other side of the spectrum was Arthur Pendleton. If you rode the Route 42 municipal bus that wound its way up the treacherous canyon roads between Oak Creek and the neighboring ski resorts, you knew Arthur. Or rather, you saw him. Nobody truly knew Arthur. He was a man in his late 50s, unassuming and practically invisible. He wore standard-issue Transit Authority gray slacks and a faded blue button-down shirt that hung loosely over his frame. He had a closely cropped salt and pepper beard, deep-set, tired gray eyes, and a weathered face that looked like it had been carved from the very granite of the Colorado mountains. Arthur walked with a slight mechanical limp in his left leg. He never spoke more than was necessary. A polite nod, a quiet, "Watch your step," or a brief, "Good evening." Arthur had been driving Route 42 for about 3 years. He was known for being impeccably on time and for handling the massive 15-ton transit bus with an eerie, effortless precision, even when the canyon roads were slick with black ice. The locals assumed he was just another washed-up retiree, perhaps an ex-truck driver who had taken a municipal job for the pension and the quiet. It was mid-January, and a bitter, howling blizzard was rolling into the valley. The sky was a bruised, heavy purple, and the snow was already beginning to stick to the asphalt, turning the roads into glass. Arthur's bus was half full, carrying a mix of exhausted resort workers, a few community college students, and an elderly woman named Mrs. Higgins, who rode the bus every Tuesday to visit her sister. The heater hissed a low, rhythmic drone, offering a warm sanctuary from the biting wind outside. At the 4th Street Transit Center, the pneumatic doors hissed open, and the freezing air rushed in, bringing with it a storm of a different kind. Trent Lawson swaggered onto the bus, flanked by 3 of his gym buddies, Greg, Liam, and a heavyweight striker named Cody. They were fresh from a local grappling seminar, their adrenaline still running high. They were loud, obnoxious, and took up entirely too much space. They wore tight-fitting athletic gear, heavily branded with MMA logos. Despite the freezing temperatures, Trent tossed a crumpled dollar bill into the fare box. The fare was $2.50. Arthur placed a scarred, calloused hand over the coin return. He didn't look up immediately. He finished logging his stop on the clipboard, his movements slow and deliberate. "Fare is $2.50, son," Arthur said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It didn't carry the sharp edge of anger, just the flat, immovable weight of a stated fact. Trent stopped halfway down the aisle and turned around, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked at his friends, making sure they were watching the performance. "I gave you $1, old man. That's a hometown discount. You should be thanking me. I even take this rolling trash can instead of driving my truck," Trent sneered, puffing out his chest. Arthur slowly lifted his head. He adjusted the aviator sunglasses he wore, despite the fading daylight, a quirk the regular passengers were used to. Behind the dark lenses, his eyes scanned Trent. He didn't see a fearsome black belt. He saw a center of gravity. He saw where Trent's weight was distributed, noted the slight flare of his elbows, and calculated the distance between the driver's seat and the yellow warning line on the floor. "The fare is $2.50. Pay it or step off my bus," Arthur repeated, his voice dropping half an octave. Greg laughed, nudging Cody. "Man, the crypt keeper is getting feisty today." Trent walked back to the front, stepping deliberately over the yellow safety line, and leaned over the low plexiglass barrier that separated the driver from the passengers. He was close enough that Arthur could smell the wintergreen chewing gum and stale energy drink on his breath. "Listen to me, you hourly wage fossil," Trent whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "I'm Trent Lawson. I own Apex down the street. I could pull you out of that seat, fold your knees backwards, and choke you unconscious before you even realize you're bleeding. Now put the bus in drive and shut your mouth." The bus fell dead silent. The hissing of the heater suddenly sounded deafening. Mrs. Higgins clutched her purse in the back row. A college student nervously looked down at his phone, pretending not to hear. Arthur didn't flinch. His heart rate didn't elevate. His breathing remained at a steady rhythmic 12 breaths per minute. He reached into his own pocket, pulled out 6 quarters, and dropped them into the fare box. The machine chimed, registering the full fare. "Take a seat," Arthur said softly. "The roads are getting bad." Trent laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He slapped the plexiglass barrier hard enough to make it rattle. "That's what I thought, Beta." He turned and swaggered to the back of the bus with his crew, taking up the disabled seating area, sprawling their legs out into the aisle. Arthur simply shifted the bus into gear, checked his mirrors, and pulled smoothly out into the driving snow. But beneath the faded flannel shirt, something old and dormant began to stir. The drive up Route 42 was a white-knuckle experience on a good day. The road hugged the edge of a steep canyon, a sheer drop-off of 300 feet on the right side, guarded only by a rusted guardrail that wouldn't stop a compact car, let alone a municipal bus. The snow was falling heavier now, thick, wet flakes that plastered themselves against the massive windshield. Arthur drove with a mechanical, flawless focus. He anticipated the slips before they happened, feathering the brakes and steering into the microscopic slides with the intuition of a man who had driven in environments far more hostile than a Colorado blizzard. In the back of the bus, Trent and his crew were growing restless. The quiet submission of the driver hadn't satisfied Trent's ego. It had only emboldened him. He was a predator who had found an environment with no resistance, and he was getting bored. Across the aisle from Trent sat a young woman, maybe 19, wearing a ski resort uniform. She had her headphones in and was staring fixedly out of the window, clearly trying to avoid the boisterous group of fighters. "Hey!" Trent called out to her, kicking the heel of his boot lightly against the plastic siding of her seat. "Hey, sweetheart." The girl kept her gaze fixed on the dark, snowy window. "Are you deaf?" Trent barked, louder this time. He reached over and yanked the headphone cord out of her phone. The girl gasped, turning to him with wide, frightened eyes. "Please, leave me alone." "Just making conversation." Trent smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He stood up, towering over her, and placed one hand on the back of her seat and the other on the seat in front of her, effectively trapping her in a cage of his own arms. "You work up at the lodge? I bet you're used to serving guys. I'm telling you to serve me some attention." Greg and Cody chuckled, feeding off the intimidation. The rest of the passengers were frozen, held hostage by the threat of explosive violence. No one wanted to intervene and become the target of 4 trained fighters. Up at the front of the bus, Arthur's eyes flicked to the massive rectangular rearview mirror. He saw the girl's terrified face. He saw Trent's aggressive posture. Arthur didn't sigh. He didn't show anger. He simply flipped a switch on the dashboard. The hydraulic brakes engaged with a massive shuddering hiss. The bus decelerated rapidly, but smoothly, pulling over onto a narrow, snow-covered turnout on the edge of the canyon. The vehicle came to a complete halt, the engine idling with a deep rumble. Arthur engaged the parking brake. "Hey, why'd we stop?" Cody yelled from the back. Arthur unbuckled his seatbelt. He picked up the PA microphone. "I need the gentleman in the black sweatshirt to step away from the young lady and take his seat." Arthur's voice echoed through the bus speakers. It was utterly devoid of emotion. It sounded like an automated warning system right before a detonation. Trent turned his head, staring down the long, illuminated aisle of the bus. At the back of the driver's head, he let go of the girl's seat and stepped fully into the center aisle. He cracked his knuckles, a broad, menacing smile spreading across his face. This was exactly what he wanted: an audience, a confrontation, a chance to impose his will. "Are you talking to me, driver?" Trent shouted, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. "Because it sounds like you're giving me an order, and I don't take orders from guys who drive a bus for a living." Trent began to walk down the aisle. He moved with the practiced, balanced steps of a martial artist, closing the distance in the cage. He was visualizing the assault: a quick step in, a collar tie, maybe a heavy knee to the sternum to wind the old man, followed by a hip toss to the floor. He'd humiliate him, leave him bruised, and walk off the bus a local legend. "Trent, leave it, man. Let's just get home," Liam muttered from the back, suddenly feeling a strange shift in the atmosphere. "Shut up," Trent snapped without looking back. He stopped just behind the yellow line, directly behind Arthur's seat. Arthur remained seated, his back to Trent. He slowly reached up and turned off the interior lights of the bus, leaving only the dim amber glow of the dashboard and the swirling white snow in the headlights. The sudden darkness changed the environment instantly. It went from a public transit vehicle to a claustrophobic, shadowed tunnel. "Turn the lights back on, old man. I want them to see this," Trent growled. Arthur finally stood up. When he turned around, he didn't square his shoulders. He stood slightly bladed, his left foot forward, his hands resting loosely at his sides. In the dim amber light, Trent couldn't see the driver's eyes behind the aviators, but he felt an inexplicable, sudden coldness radiate from the older man. It was a feeling Trent had never encountered in the gym. On the mats, even against tough opponents, there were rules. There was a referee, there was a clock, there was a mutual understanding that both men got to go home to their families afterward. The man standing in front of him had none of that energy. Arthur was projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying finality. "I won't ask you again," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying perfectly over the rumble of the engine. "Sit down." Trent's ego violently rejected the sudden spike of fear in his gut. He lunged forward, throwing a heavy, looping right hook, aimed directly at Arthur's jaw, intending to knock the driver out cold in a single highlight reel strike. To Trent, the punch was lightning fast. In the regional MMA circuit, it was a strike that had dropped a dozen men. To Arthur Pendleton, the punch moved like it was submerged in molasses. Arthur didn't block. Blocking was for point fighting. Arthur evaded, slipping his head a fraction of an inch to the left, allowing the heavy fist to sail past his ear, crashing harmlessly into the plexiglass barrier behind him. Before Trent could retract his arm, Arthur moved. It wasn't Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It wasn't Muay Thai. It was the brutal, horrifyingly efficient science of military close-quarters combat, designed not to score points, but to instantly dismantle the human nervous system and neutralize a lethal threat in a confined space. Arthur's right hand shot up, his palm striking the inside of Trent's extended elbow. There was a sickening pop as the joint hyperextended. Trent opened his mouth to scream, but the sound never materialized. Arthur stepped into Trent's guard, entirely ignoring the young man's size advantage. He drove his left forearm like a steel bar directly into Trent's throat, specifically the vagus nerve on the side of the neck. The strike wasn't meant to crush the windpipe. It was meant to overload the brain's blood pressure sensors. Trent's eyes rolled back in his head. His legs turned to jelly. His entire worldview, his years of training, his arrogance, all of it vanished in a microsecond of blinding structural agony. As Trent began to collapse, Arthur didn't let him fall. He grabbed Trent by the collar of his expensive MMA sweatshirt and spun him around, using the young man's falling momentum to slam him face first into the metal handrail of the front stairwell. Trent crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, clutching his ruined elbow, completely incapacitated. The entire sequence had taken less than 2.5 seconds. The bus was dead silent. The passengers were paralyzed, their brains struggling to process how the hulking, aggressive alpha male had just been folded like a cheap lawn chair by an arthritic senior citizen. In the back, Greg, Liam, and Cody jumped to their feet. Cody, the heavyweight, let out a roar and charged down the aisle. "You're dead meat, old man!" Arthur stepped over Trent's writhing body. He didn't take a fighting stance. He just stood there, waiting in the narrow aisle. Cody threw a massive front kick, aiming to push Arthur backward into the windshield. Arthur sidestepped the kick with the grace of a matador. As Cody's leg extended past him, Arthur delivered a devastating, piston-like kick with his heavy work boot directly to the side of Cody's knee. The joint buckled inward with a horrific snapping sound. Cody shrieked, collapsing into a heap in the aisle, clutching his leg in pure agony. Arthur looked up at Greg and Liam, who were frozen halfway down the bus. The two young men looked at their gym leader, crying on the floor by the stairs, and their heavyweight enforcer, screaming in the aisle. Arthur didn't say a word. He simply raised one hand and pointed a calloused finger toward the back row of seats. Greg and Liam didn't hesitate. They scrambled backward, practically climbing over each other to get to the furthest corner of the bus, raising their hands in terrified surrender. Arthur calmly reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a small, heavy tactical flashlight, and clicked it on, sweeping the beam over the two downed men to ensure they were no longer a threat. Satisfied they were neutralized, he turned his back on them, stepped over Trent again, and sat back down in the driver's seat. He picked up his radio microphone. "Dispatch, this is Route 42. I have a 1039 on board. 2 aggressive passengers subdued. Requesting law enforcement and EMTs at the mile marker, 14 turnout. Over?" "Copy that, 42. Units are en route. Are you injured, Arthur?" The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Negative, dispatch. Just a bit of a delay." For the next 15 minutes, no one on the bus moved. The only sounds were the howling wind outside, the idling engine, and the pathetic, agonizing moans of Trent and Cody. The college student in the front row stared at Arthur, his mouth slightly open, looking at the back of the driver's head as if he were looking at a superhero or a monster. Blue and red lights soon began to cut through the blizzard, reflecting off the white snow. 2 Oak Creek Sheriff's Department SUVs pulled up behind the bus, followed shortly by an ambulance. Deputy Sheriff Mike Carlson, a massive, bearded man who had been with the department for 20 years, boarded the bus, his hand resting on his sidearm. He took one look at the carnage in the aisle. Trent Lawson, the local tough guy, weeping and clutching a dislocated elbow, and Cody, the heavyweight, unable to put weight on his leg. Carlson looked past them to the driver's seat. Arthur was calmly logging the incident on his clipboard. "Jesus Christ, Art!" Carlson muttered, stepping over Trent. "What happened here?" Trent looked up at the deputy, his face pale, spit and tears mixing on his chin. "Arrest him!" Trent sobbed, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur. "He assaulted us! He's a psycho! I want to press charges!" Carlson looked down at Trent. He recognized the kid. Everyone in town knew Trent and his abrasive gym crew. Then Carlson looked back at Arthur. The deputy let out a long, heavy sigh. He unclipped his radio. "Dispatch, we're going to need a tow for the suspects and run a background for a formal report." Carlson knelt down next to Trent, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "What are you doing?" Trent screamed, panicking as Carlson secured his uninjured wrist. "I'm the victim here. He attacked me." Carlson leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that only Trent could hear. "Listen to me very carefully, you stupid kid. You don't know who you just swung at." "He's a bus driver," Trent hissed, wincing in pain. "His name is Arthur Hayes," Carlson said, his eyes hard. 10 years ago, he was Commander Arthur Hayes, United States Navy. He ran SEAL Team 3, Task Unit Bruiser. He spent 4 deployments in Ramadi clearing houses in hand-to-hand combat against insurgents. The only reason you are currently breathing is because he decided to let you. Trent's blood ran cold. The pain in his elbow suddenly felt secondary to the icy dread pooling in his stomach. He looked past the deputy's shoulder to the front of the bus. Arthur had taken off his aviators to wipe the lenses. For a split second, Trent saw his eyes. There was no anger in them, no adrenaline, no pride. Just the empty 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen the darkest corners of the earth and survived them all. "You're going to jail, Trent," Carlson said, hauling the young man to his feet. "And you're going to pray to whatever God you believe in that Commander Hayes doesn't decide to press charges of his own." The fluorescent lights of the Oak Creek Memorial Hospital emergency room buzzed with a sickly pale hum. Trent Lawson lay on a stiff gurney, his right wrist handcuffed to the metal bed rail. The adrenaline had long since burned out of his system, replaced by a nauseating, throbbing agony that radiated from his right arm to his jaw. His elbow was swollen to the size of a grapefruit, locked at a grotesque angle. Down the hall, he could faintly hear Cody groaning as the orthopedic surgeon explained the devastating reality of a shattered patella and torn ligaments. Cody's fighting career was over before it had even truly begun.